everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to this Town and Country Planning Association webinar with Waltham Forest Council and the Young Foundation. Really pleased to meet you all. Abby, if we could have the first slide up, please. The title of this webinar this afternoon is the London Borough of Waltham Forest's 15-minute neighbourhood framework. My name is Gemma Hyde. I'm the Project Officer for Healthier Places at the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm going to be chairing this event. We are very grateful today to be sponsored by the Sport England and the Young Foundation, and without their support we would not be able to run this webinar for free. So we're very grateful that they were able to provide support so that we can have all of you here for free this afternoon. We will get going in just one moment as people are allowed to join, and there'll be a mixture of speakers today from Waltham Forest Council and the Young Foundation. Next slide, please, Abby. So the Town and Country Planning Association are a charity, and we have the vision of homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. Today's webinar is actually the 5th in a series that the TCPA have been running since 2020 about 20-minute neighbourhoods. And these are sometimes known as 15-minute neighbourhoods, 15-minute cities, or complete, compact and connected communities. In 2021, the TCPA published a free guide to 20-minute neighbourhoods, and this can be downloaded from our website. And we continue to promote and support places all over the UK to interpret and implement the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. If you'd like to know any more about the TCPA or about our 20-minute neighbourhood work, then please visit our website. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is going to focus on Waltham Forest, and like many councils, Waltham Forest wants to create a healthier, more sustainable and cohesive borough. And by introducing a 15-minute neighbourhood framework, they are forging ahead. This afternoon will be led through the framework and the research and vision behind it by a team from Waltham Forest Council and their partners in this work, the Young Foundation. The work that has been done demonstrates the breadth and depth of what is possible with a 15-minute neighbourhood approach, and will hopefully resonate with many of you in terms of your own places and your own projects, and what can be done to find new ways of working with communities to create healthy and thriving places. Next slide, please. The agenda for the afternoon is on the screen, and we are planning to take a short break at about 2:30. Please do not leave the Zoom call at the break, but just leave your computers running, but obviously feel free to step away from the screen for a few minutes. There will be a question and answer session towards the end of the webinar, so throughout, please do use the questions box at the bottom and leave questions there for all the presenters, and we will try and sort of wrap those up and get questions answered, especially around the key themes, and do as much of that as possible before we end at 3:30. Next slide, please. So to start the afternoon, I would like to welcome Councillor Grace Williams. Councillor Grace Williams is the leader of Waltham Forest Council, and she'll be talking to us about Waltham Forest's ambitions for 15-minute neighbourhoods and why this is an important opportunity for local people and the future of Waltham Forest. Councillor Williams, if you'd like to turn on your video and your microphone, please.
Hi, I've done that now. Can everyone see me?
That's great.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invite today. I'm really delighted to be here with colleagues and with the Young Foundation so that we can talk about what 15-minute neighbourhoods has been in our area. And I think you're right, Gemma, to highlight that there's not much difference between 15 and 20 minutes, and that it's best not to get too tied up on the labels for things like that. So for us in Waltham Forest, what we wanted to do is we wanted to focus on the hyperlocal. So as we see it, the 15-minute neighbourhoods work, which we've started on, is a massively exciting piece of work that we're doing with our residents. And it's an important week for us because we will be bringing our plan around 15-minute neighbourhoods to council on Thursday, and this will form our corporate framework. So it will be the approach that will underlie all the work that we're doing as a borough. So it's highly important to us in Waltham Forest. First of all, I wanted to say what a great partnership we've had with the Young Foundation. So they've worked with us, they've put together a set of engaging research questions and tasks, which has really helped us to understand the needs and the wants of our communities. So without them, I don't think we'd have been able to understand what our residents saw 15-minute neighbourhoods to be. So the research and the resulting corporate framework that we're just beginning is going to guide our work and how we approach all our priorities in Waltham Forest. So we did not start this process from scratch. I think it's fair to say that Waltham Forest is an area where 15-minute neighbourhoods fits really, really well, because we're a borough that doesn't have one large town centre, rather we have lots of different neighbourhood centres. So it kind of came naturally for us to look at our borough in that way. So just a few examples that we're really proud of in Waltham Forest, which we've already successfully applied the principles of 15-minute neighbourhoods to put a bit of kind of practicality into what 15-minute neighbourhoods is. So enjoy Waltham Forest, or many of you might have known it in the beginning as Mini Holland. We are one of the boroughs that has pioneered an approach to active travel, which is about focusing on what each of our neighbourhoods needs in terms of walking, cycling and public realm. So that's a vital example of what we mean by 15-minute neighbourhoods. And I should say that if you look in some of our neighbourhoods where we've pioneered our low traffic neighbourhood approach, it's had a massive impact on other areas of life within that. So for example, local businesses have changed, they've taken over the pavements, they've seen a massive increase in footfall and a really, really different kind of distinctive character now that the streets are free for people to use for walking and cycling. We were also the Mayor of London's first borough of culture, which was about putting culture in the heart of local communities. And one of the distinctive things about how we delivered that was we wanted culture right throughout our whole borough, rather than in a couple of places in the borough. And our award-winning Choose Local, which was our campaign coming out of the pandemic to encourage people to choose local businesses. And it really highlighted those local business people at the heart of our community. It profiled them and it showed that they were not only providing products, but they were also providing a really unique flavour to our neighbourhoods. I should also mention that our regeneration projects are never just about transforming Waltham Forest, but they're about people, and they're about making sure that people have a chance to influence where they live. And a good example of that is how we've reformed Fellowship Square. So Fellowship Square was our fairly traditional, very beautiful, but fairly traditional town hall complex. And working with the community, we've transformed that. A shining example of what I mean when I say that is we talked to residents about what they wanted from their town hall. And we've now created a fountain which is in use 365 days of the year. It lights up, it's got a variety of shows. But the important thing is every day, children, families, residents are there at the fountains using it as their space. So it's brought in our residents from somewhere that they would have felt quite excluded before, because it used to just be a mini roundabout with cars going round. And we're really keen to learn. So we're keen to learn from those on the call, from other local authorities. We've been looking at examples around the world, for example, in Melbourne and Paris. And we've been looking at how they've transformed their places and had a positive impact on communities. So we have had a lot of success already with having a 15-minute neighbourhood approach, but we're learning as we go, as we work towards what each of our 15-minute neighbourhoods is going to be. And I just wanted to say a little bit about our approach and what 15-minute neighbourhoods is and isn't, because Gemma, I think you mentioned that you mentioned the concept of 15-minute cities, and We've seen a lot of controversy recently, even making its way into Parliament about 15-minute cities. But let's be clear, 15-minute cities, 15-minute neighbourhoods are not about restricting people. They're not about putting a point on a map, drawing a circle around it and saying, there you go, that's your neighbourhood. Neighbourhoods are shaped around people. So we shouldn't really get overly obsessed with placing people in neighbourhoods. Neighbourhoods are where people connect. And also, if you look at every local authority is based on wards. Now, electoral wards can be seen as quite arbitrary, small areas, but because of the way that councillors and residents work together in those wards, they're a really important way of sort of focusing on the hyperlocal. So it's not about creating lots of new areas. It's about understanding that people connect most to where they live and working on that principle. And we've tested ideas of 15-minute neighbourhoods with the Young Foundation, with residents, asking them what it means for them and their communities. Even though the idea is quite abstract, they understood the idea, especially when they started to talk about what it meant for their local area. And they were really enthusiastic about being part of creating something different for Waltham Forest. So, why 15-minute neighbourhoods for Waltham Forest? The reason is we recognise the power of neighbourhoods. So we're at a very difficult time, I would say, both for local government and for the country, when we have a really complex set of challenges. And we know that working together not only brings people together, those people that are in their local areas, they might be raising their family, setting up a home, but it also allows us to tackle some of these challenges that I've spoken about and to tackle global issues. So just kind of a few ideas of where we focus, and when I say challenges, what we mean. When it comes to taking climate action, there's a lot that we can do as a borough, and there's a lot that we expect national government to do. But unless we can work with our residents on what it means for their neighbourhoods in terms of growing food, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of biodiversity, we're not going to be able to make the difference that we need. So it is a really practical response to climate action, and it's something that people want, because they want to feel like they are taking action and they are being empowered. So climate action is one good example. Getting through a pandemic has also taught us a lot. It's forged daily relationships with our community and voluntary sector, and it's meant that we're working with them on a day-to-day level to help ensure that they've got what they need in terms of food, in terms of spaces, in terms of support from us to manage the cost of living crisis. So it is about problem solving. It's about joint problem solving. It's about understanding that if you live somewhere, you have great insight into the problems that are happening. It helps us to tackle complex and connected issues because it's getting us together to make sure that our actions are joined up and local. So I always think it's better to talk about an example. Okay, so an example in my ward is we have an area where residents have been complaining for a really long time about the sexual harassment and street harassment that they'd faced in an area. Now, we struggled for quite a long time to look at what we could do in terms of enforcement, and there were some things we could do in terms of making sure that the police were aware. But what we really found started to make a difference is when we were in that space having conversations with residents. So I can remember some Friday nights where I wheeled out my own gazebo, and we had nighttime surgeries where we talked to all the different people in the area, the businesses, some of the people hanging around the area, residents. And it was that started us thinking about what we needed in that space to make it better. There were many different aspects of what we needed. We needed strong relationships with businesses. We needed to make sure that we improve lighting, public realm, that we work with the Residents Association to transform that space in terms of planters and little libraries, for example. But we needed also to have a really strong relationship between the council's community safety team, the police, residents, and some of the community stakeholders there. So it is about taking that joint action. And it's only when we do that that we can really deal with what the problem is. So we want to make sure that our residents are confident in us, but confident that they can be part of the positive change that they want to see. So just to focus a bit on what it means for residents, as a Waltham Forest resident, I'm really excited by what it means for our community. Our 15-minute approach means that residents will have everything that they need to thrive, but also when things go wrong, they'll know that they can get involved in forming a solution to this. And it is an approach that is going to be felt borough-wide, because it's not really only about what services we offer, what our facilities are. It's about changing the way we work with people. So it's going to be as much a challenge to us inside the town hall, getting outside the town hall, as it will be to residents if we're going to work in this way. And it is incredibly exciting, especially at a time when local government has been through a really difficult decade when it comes to financial sustainability, when it comes to, I think, a notion from government that we should be managing decline, to have a positive vision and to have a clear idea about how we should be working with our communities. And I'm really pleased that I can say that in Waltham Forest, we're now firmly in delivery mode. We're, for example, starting to pilot a new approach to community safety. So this is about working with the police and our community safety team and residents in some of our areas where we know that community safety is a big concern, to look at practically the actions we can take. We're also changing the way we deliver our work around family hubs so that it's closer to what people need and where people live. And we also, at the same time, have a really strong agenda in terms of bringing investment in from development and from government sources such as levelling up, so that we can make sure that we also have an ambitious agenda in terms of that investment. So examples include bringing a theatre to the first time for the borough, Soho Theatre Walthamstow, which is a project that's really firmly rooted in the community, because it's not only about a theatre venue, it's also about programmes to work with community groups, youth groups, schools, and people that are seeking employment, to make sure that there are real opportunities there. We also have a new project around creating a new Lido in the borough, which is again about talking to people in an area in the borough about what a health and wellbeing hub and a Lido with lots and lots of leisure facilities could be. So it has to be twinned with a really ambitious approach to what we can get into the borough in terms of investment. And I think it's important that we do both things at the same time. So I am really proud about what we've achieved. What I found, because I've had lots of conversations with people about 15-minute neighbourhoods, is it really comes to life, and I hope you'll see that when you see our video. It really comes to life when you're talking about an actual area, when you can see the difference that it makes in terms of active travel, for example, or in terms of how we work with children and families in an area. So seeing it is believing, and for me, the next year will be about putting it into practice in some areas to show that it can make that difference. So early when we started talking about 15-minute neighbourhoods, we made this video so that we could help explain it. And I'm sure the video will explain it much better than I could. So I hope you'll enjoy the video as a first step to seeing what 15-minute neighbourhoods could mean.
We're leading a local revolution on the streets of Waltham Forest. 15-minute neighbourhoods are a new way of living in a city where everything's easily within reach. The people of Waltham Forest have told us that 15-minute neighbourhoods should be a priority for the council. The message from you is clear. Life's better when it's local. You said that 15-minute neighbourhoods are important to you because they build tight-knit communities. They make it easier for everyone to get around. They help your area thrive, and they're great for the planet. So we're making 15-minute neighbourhoods a reality for local people. We've transformed our libraries and public buildings, improving accessibility so they can serve their communities better. We've created more bike routes to help you get around easier. We've invested in our high streets and rallied our communities to choose local businesses. And we've turned unused land into mini parks throughout Waltham Forest. We were the first borough of culture, with activities taking place at every corner. And today, culture is always on your doorstep, from the Orient Stadium, film festivals and arts trails, to the newly created Fellowship Square, and the upcoming theatre at the former Granada EMD. Living in the heart of a vibrant community is important to all of us. That's why we're pioneering 15-minute neighbourhoods, because life's better when it's local.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Councillor Williams. It was a really, really great introduction to today's webinar. And I'm looking forward to sort of getting into the detail with the other speakers going forward. But it was actually brilliant that you focused on choice and connection and all these sort of great co-benefits that the 15-minute neighbourhood approach can bring. So we really appreciate your time. And now we're going to hand over to John Lloyd, who is going to take us through the next stage of this. So with a focus on the approach that Waltham Forest have taken and moving from concept to practice. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma, and great to see so many people and great to kind of share our learning and experience of this, and we've got a great way to go. So just to move into the next slide, really, I'll kick off. I'm John Lloyd. I'm the Corporate Director of Strategy and Change, and played a kind of key role of bringing it together, working with colleagues, Ian Ray, who's also on this call, and developing this framework. But to go back in time, we're at Fork and Road. Of course, we had all those strengths that were kind of captured in the video in terms of some of the, particularly the place-based interventions we've made to improve neighbourhoods. I suppose what we had a choice of whether or not we brought together the evidence that we had and develop a framework quickly, based on our conversations and our learning from Paris and other places within the UK, for example. But we did a bit of an engagement based on that video, just to kind of explore what people's reflections and experiences were of their neighbourhood. And we started to see a bit of just that it was perhaps a little bit more complicated, and that's not a surprise coming out of the pandemic and facing some of the challenges, interconnected challenges that we face as a borough, we face all over the UK. Those including the housing crisis, cost of living crisis, which was starting to emerge, climate crisis, and we have challenges around fear of feeling safe within the borough that the council kind of spoke to as a really kind of great practical example. So we faced complexity and we faced uncertainty, and we also knew as a truth that a lot of positive change happens within neighbourhoods, especially when we see the strengths of people and the strengths of communities and not just their needs. So thinking about how we face complexity and how we face uncertainty, we thought we needed to go deeper, and whilst it would take a longer amount of time, we knew it would be worth it, and what we might develop would be something that wouldn't be made be a technical process that we would make, albeit based on evidence. It would be something that really reflected the experiences and needs of our residents in a borough that's kind of gone through a pretty kind of tough time in a pandemic, and is obviously facing all sorts of challenges as well. And the last thing to mention as well is just the importance of inequality and diversity in that as well. So we were aware that actually it's probably not a great idea to tell residents what their 50-minute neighbourhood is. They may live in lots of different ways. I mean, even live next to a boundary of what would be prescribed 50-minute neighbourhood. And we also knew that people's aspirations and experiences are different at different points of their life, but also different within the borough, which is really diverse. We have areas of significant deprivation in the south. We have more kind of suburban areas in the north, and we wanted to really understand and listen to people from different areas and at different points of their life. And who better to work with to do that deeper bit of engagement, who understand those challenges and understand those tensions perhaps, and that was the Young Foundation. So what we're going to go through today is really spend a bit of time bringing that research and evidence to life that helped us to understand that and develop a framework that we believe perhaps reimagines 50-minute neighbourhoods to a significant degree, from a primary place-based approach to something that understands the interconnected importance of understanding the potential of place, of course, but also how we work and the experience of people, and then also challenging ourselves and our partners in how we lead in terms of making that vision realised. So I'm going to hand over now, just as a kind of framing, to kickstart the rest of the session.
Great, thanks very much, John, and we look forward to hearing from you again shortly. So this next bit is going to be led by Sian White and Alice Bell. Sian is the Head of Strategic Design and Insight for the Young Foundation, and Alice is a Senior Researcher, and they're going to lead through the vision and the framework. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. So it's really wonderful to be with you today, talking about our work with Waltham Forest and what we learned and what we found. So as Gemma highlighted, we're going to be talking about in this next section the research and community engagement that underpinned and enabled the creation of this vision framework within Waltham Forest. So we'll cover a little bit about what we did, how we did it, and what we found as a result of that research. But where I'd like to start, and next slide please, is just a little bit of a reflection on how we saw the opportunity of working with Waltham Forest and why we wanted to be involved. And it really speaks to some of the things that Councillor Williams and John have just mentioned in their introduction about the opportunity within a borough that has a long history of thinking about neighbourhoods and thinking about 50-minute neighbourhoods, but one that was willing to take a different approach and was also keen to learn from others and keen to share their learning. So we really wanted to be involved in supporting them to do that. A couple of other things kind of spoke to us, and hopefully will come through today's presentations and the way that we've approached this is we were really impressed and wanted to be involved in that commitment to a resident-led vision, and the fact that that's the heart of this approach. And that's what you'll hear a lot about as we go through our next presentation. We also thought it was really interesting the way that kind of Waltham Forest was starting to think about how they could think about data, but also community and voice, and how we could put together those two things to create a way of thinking about 15-minute neighbourhoods. One of the things that we were also interested in, as kind of we flagged, is how we hold this concept of 15 minutes loosely. And actually the fact that Waltham Forest were really interested in how they could explore that and think about it differently really was something interesting given the interest within this kind of topic. And so, yeah, we really wanted to kind of bring to bear some of the Young Foundation's experience of working really closely with communities, our experience of community research and doing it meaningfully, as well as our understanding of social innovation within local government. So as a result of kind of really recognising that ambition and opportunity of the Waltham Forest, what we constructed was an approach and methodology to support the council to realise some of their ambitions. I'll give a bit of an overview of that, and then I'll hand over to Alice to talk more about the detail of what we found. So our next slide. Thank you. So we designed a kind of methodology that brought together data and community insight to think about creating a vision and a framework that was resident-led, but also data-rich. So we started off broad in the first instance, which was working with residents and crowdsourcing what might be some of their priorities and ideas for what is needed within their localities, building on existing insight gathered by the council to do that. And we did that through both online and offline methods. We then prioritised that with residents through partnership setting workshops to help them think through and work through together actually what does this mean for different local areas and what are some of those priorities about what they might need and how we think about 15 minutes flexibly. We also undertook deep work working with residents using ethnographic techniques to understand actually what might this mean for their lives, what are some of their needs and ambitions within this area as we start to think about bringing 15 minutes to life. What we also did running along is also a range of different rounds of data analysis. So starting first of all by thinking about what data do we have to hand and mapping what was existing already within Waltham Forest, taking some of the kind of known concepts that are often associated with 15-minute neighbourhoods, but then iterating that by bringing in what we were learning from residents about what was important to them in their local areas and thinking about what data we could use to then map and understand what was the current situation of Waltham Forest. And Alice will talk a little bit more about that later on. And where we got to was developing this vision and framework that Waltham Forest could take forwards. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those next steps as we go through today's conversation. And the final kind of component of our kind of work streams was really critical support and feedback from an advisory group. We really wanted to challenge ourselves to be credible and to think robustly in the space, but also to learn from others as well in this topic. And John's spoken a little bit about that before. So a really big thank you to them for being involved. Next slide, please. So what you can hear and what you'll hear a lot about over the next couple of hours is about how we were blending, thinking about really reaching and talking out to residents and communities about what they wanted, but also blending that with data. And what we did is to think about a whole range of different types of creative and participatory methods that would help to unlock insights and engage residents in conversation about what this could mean in their local areas. And so we developed a range of online and offline methods to do that. For example, engaging residents in missions to help think about how they use their local space, but what that might mean for their future, mapping out what they do currently and what they need in their local spaces, drawing their visions for the future, as well as also looking at what data is to hand that we can use to map and understand what that looks like at the moment. So bringing those two things together. And finally, in our next slide, one of the things that was really important to us that we held throughout approaching this task and thinking about how we designed our methods and approaches is recognising that we really wanted to hear from different people across the borough and also work across that borough. So in thinking about this, we wanted to make sure we designed methods where we could speak to a diverse range of people, and particularly those that might not typically engage with processes of talking about what they want from their local areas, etc. And it was great working with the Waltham Forest team on this to understand actually typically who tends to engage in consultation processes or insight processes before, so that we could think about what some of the methods that we could design to reach out and enable some of those voices that otherwise might not be heard to be able to inform this approach, both through thinking about how we did our different methods. But the other thing that we really kind of wanted to make sure, as John was saying, is we recognise that this is a borough with lots of different areas across it, you know, from in terms of how that works. So we designed an approach that both looked across the borough in the way that we were capturing insight, but also focused on some hyperlocal case study areas as well that maybe help to explain and think about some of that complexity and diversity that sits within Waltham Forest as a borough. And one of the things we're particularly thinking about there is how do we think about pre-existing neighbourhoods, but also maybe where will we start to look and speak to residents that maybe sit between some of those traditional kind of neighbourhood areas and some of those areas which have maybe had development more recently and some of those that haven't had as much yet. So really trying to think about how do we speak to a range of people in putting together what is a borough approach, but needs to work locally and needs to work for a whole range of different people within the borough. So hopefully that sets the scene behind why we wanted to be involved and our overarching approach. I'm going to hand over next to Alice, who will talk you through more about what we found and what that enabled.
Thank you, Sian. So on the next slide, yeah, thanks. Yeah, as Sian said, I'm going to talk through the findings from our research with residents and show how that fed into and informed a resident-led vision for 15-minute neighbourhoods. So as Sian said, we started off really expansively and crowdsourced priorities for a 15-minute neighbourhood from residents across the borough from different backgrounds through a range of different online and offline research tasks. These were really designed to get residents thinking about what they wanted from their local area. And this helped us to develop a long list of ideas, some of which are on the left-hand side of your screen. And what became apparent as residents contributed their ideas was that there were some things that they thought a 15-minute neighbourhood should have, such as green spaces or cycling infrastructure. But there were also those more qualitative things and experiences that they thought a 15-minute neighbourhood should enable, such as a feeling of belonging or a sense of community. And cutting across all of these ideas, strong themes of inclusion, safety and accessibility emerged and continue to be apparent throughout the different stages of our research. So on the next slide, you can see this quote from one resident really exemplifies how it became very important that any vision or framework move beyond thinking about 15-minute neighbourhoods as just what assets are in your neighbourhood. So as they said, things like a GP or shops are obviously essential, but really what makes a place and builds a sense of community is bigger than that, and isn't just about those assets. So on the next slide, from those long lists of ideas about what might be included in a 15-minute neighbourhood, as Sian said, we went through a priority setting in partnership process with different groups from different areas across the borough, and also cross-cutting groups such as young people, to really distill down what was important for these different places and groups of people. And again, we distinguished between what are those things that residents think a 15-minute neighbourhood should have, from those essential services, things that are free to use and make it easy to get around, and make a place suitable for people of all ages, as well as those experiences and feelings that a 15-minute neighbourhood should enable. Here they prioritise things about having a say in decisions in your local area, feeling safe, being able to spend time and stay in a place through different phases of your life, and feeling welcomed in your neighbourhood. So as well as those themes of safety, belonging and inclusion, other themes emerge about health and wellbeing, greater inclusion and social connection. And whilst that process of prioritising often was quite difficult for residents involved because lots of things felt important, they began to think about how different things link together and some of the secondary consequences and outcomes of prioritising different things first. So on the next slide, our approach therefore in thinking about priorities together in partnership really also wanted to stay attuned to the diverse experiences, places and people across the borough and in different neighbourhoods. So as Sian said, we did a lot of deep work with different creative methods to be able to really hear about these rich experiences of people's daily lives and how that would inform what they want from a 15-minute neighbourhood. So on the left, you can see an activity we did where we asked people to personify their place and what it was like and what they wanted their neighbourhoods to be in the future, but also how they think it might change. And on the right, you can see some examples of like mapping exercise we asked residents to do to think about things that they needed and wanted from the neighbourhood in different distances from their homes. So you can see that the pink one at the top, that was for someone with a chronic health condition. So it was really important that lots of their things they needed and wanted were quite close to their home. Whereas the bottom one is from a young parent with a young family, and they were able to travel further and access things digitally. However, they really noticed what changed and what was needed for them, or more nice to haves, and commented how things like play areas and community hubs and community centres at one time in their life might have thought was a nice to have, but became a real lifeline when they had young children. So on the next slide, there's a nice visual of how this all comes together for different people. But what emerged with this like collective ambition for different assets, services and spaces was that you really need to tailor your experiences differently for different people's needs and wants. And our discussions with residents really highlighted what was critical across the board for everyone, and what might be more nice to have for different people in different circumstances. What residents recognised is that a 150-minute neighbourhood can't and probably shouldn't have everything, but those themes that I've mentioned already of inclusion, access, social connection and safety, if that cuts across what is in each 50-minute neighbourhood, or each fluid 50-minute neighbourhood, then that can really help cater to the diverse circumstances and preferences of people in the borough. So on the next slide, what we overall found that residents were quite positive about this idea. As Councillor Williams said, they found it easy to understand and connect with, and essentially thought it was a good thing to have lots of different things available within easy reach. However, as we had more and more discussions, how this was put into place in practice became critical. So our participatory research and engagement approach really allowed us to build that nuanced understanding and have honest conversations with residents. And on the right of the slide is some of the considerations that this highlighted, such as like, what does it take to enable active travel and reduce reliance on cars? How can we have really great ambitions for the future of your local area, but also deal with some of those more pressing things in the short term? Councillor Williams also already talked about some of those discussions and challenges about personal safety and how that affects different people in different ways, and different times of day in accessing their local area, and how we balance responsibilities for reducing carbon emissions and tackling climate issues. There's also ideas about how you invest across different neighbourhoods to make sure each meet a good minimum standard, but then different areas have different characters and aren't all just homogenised in one model as well. And as a result, there was genuine appetite through all the people we spoke with to continue this participatory engagement and continue these conversations. And our recommendation was that this sort of ethos would really help tackle some of those considerations and work honestly with residents as the council implemented a 50-minute neighbourhood framework. So on the next slide, as Sean said, that throughout all of this engagement with residents, it was also underpinned by building a data picture. So we started off by collating lots of different data sets that seemed relevant to this 50-minute neighbourhood concept within the borough, and started doing some analysis on that to contextualise our qualitative work. But then as soon as we started talking to residents and hearing their ideas, we added data sets to that and furthered that analysis to look at how Waltham Forest how close Waltham Forest might be to be achieving 50-minute neighbourhoods today. And we also identified areas where there might not actually quite be the data available now to make that judgment, but made recommendations about how they could continue to build that data picture and use that to inform decision making going forward. So on the next slide, you can see some of the experimentation we did with all the data, and we started off, for example, by like looking at clusters and seeing how different parts of the borough had different characteristics and fared under different metrics, and then we moved towards developing a prototype for an index that brings together those themes that residents prioritised through the engagement and qualitative work, and looks at metrics to measure those against, and can therefore map them on these clawed path maps and see which areas are doing better or worse under those things that residents identified as wanting from 15-minute neighbourhoods. So on the next slide, finally, we brought this all together to develop an indicator framework that the council can use to look at the local context and then use different metrics to know where they're at with all these things that residents identified as priorities, and then measure the outcomes that has on local conditions. And our colleagues from Waltham Forest will talk you through this more later. But for now, I'll pass back to Sian to sort of show where that takes us.
Thank you very much there, Alice. So what Alice is taking you through there is the approach that we went through over last summer to work with residents in the council to put together this vision and framework. And what I'll show now is just some of the kind of conclusions of that. So first of all, on our next slide, where we were really kind of happy to be able to get to is really creating this vision for 15-minute neighbourhoods that was in residents' words, so directly from their experiences and also what they wanted from their local areas. And what you'll see shortly is that in more kind of indicator form, but to put it in kind of residents' words and perspectives. My 15-minute neighbourhood has the things I need in my day-to-day life and enables me to have the good access to, benefit from, and play a role in shaping what my neighbourhood has to offer to me and my community. It goes beyond the things I need most and focuses on ensuring me and my neighbours feel safe, welcomed and valued, and that I have the opportunity to, alongside others, take part in ways that work for me to make my community great now and in the future. A statement that recognises what individuals need, that idea around how we think about community strength and what we need now and what we work towards in the future. And that underpins the approach that you'll see as that Waltham Forest are developing and taking forwards, as we said, into delivery now. What you'll also see if we go to our next slide is that the way that we've approached thinking about 15-minute neighbourhoods and also the one that's emerged is a little bit different maybe from some of the ways that 15-minute neighbourhoods have been thought about in the past. It is that simple concept, but one that also needs nuance. So key to the heart of that is thinking about 15 minutes from a resident's, from a community's perspective, and knowing that that might look different depending on your circumstances. So, for example, thinking about how far you can get in 15 minutes, but also what can get to you in 15 minutes, thinking about the impact of our digital world has been really key to thinking about this slightly flexible way of thinking about 15 minutes. That Waltham Forest are adopting and thinking about, particularly thinking there about how do we recognise some of those spaces that might exist between traditional kind of neighbourhood centres and 15 minutes. As a result, it's really centering on how residents are experiencing their neighbourhoods, building on existing behaviours and how they work, but also considering some of those existing communities and identities that already exist in different localities across the borough and how they might be retained and enhanced in the future. We also kind of recognise that 15-minute neighbourhoods does come with choices and decisions around what are critical needs and wants, but actually they are a mechanism to have that conversation to navigate some of those tensions and challenges as things are implemented from the abstract into what happens in the future. So on our final slide, we pull together both the opening kind of vision and framework for Waltham Forest from this research and engagement process. But we also provided some recommendations as well to them, which we've been really happy to see have been enacted in this initial kind of phase of work. So first of all, on the left, we had some principles for practice. So really recognising that it's not just about what you do, it's also about how you do it and how you approach this topic and to take it on into delivery. So things about how Waltham Forest could take an ambitious and unique approach to 15 minutes. Some of the things that you just heard about in terms of how 15 minutes is thought about, but also what it might mean at that strategic level across the organisation. We did also kind of think that there's something here about taking a phased approach. We recognise not everything can happen at once, and actually this is a long-term journey for the borough, but one that is an opportunity to test, learn, iterate as they go. Although strong start already in terms of some of the immediate work that has taken place. And the final kind of principle here is to work with residents to deliver that vision. So not just to communicate the journey, but actually involve them in that practice. And what that led to is a series of kind of recommendations and actions, which are available in our full report to look at in more detail. But to cover those kind of three primary conclusions, One was to be a leader on 50-minute neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest and beyond. So hopefully you can see that demonstrated here in terms of that opportunity to openly share our process, but including a bit of the warts and all around that, and how that might enable others to share and learn. So that keenness to learning coming out there. But also to be a leader in terms of actually really using this as an opportunity to think about what it might mean to tackle inequalities in the borough and to think about fairness. One of the things that's really come across from working with Waltham Forest and the way that they've been thinking about looking at the data and what is currently the picture within Waltham Forest is that opportunity to really meaningfully think about where different actions might support different neighbourhoods to be enhanced and to come up to that kind of standard across the borough in the way that residents want it to, in making sure that across a broad spectrum of people feel included, safe, and have access to what they need. Also, a keen part and around the approach that we've taken here is a participatory one that involves residents, and a real clear recommendation and action here to continue that work, to meaningfully work with residents and shaping 50-minute neighbourhoods within the borough. So building on those opportunities around ongoing dialogue, but also where there might be resident-led action and organic opportunities to involve residents in this practice. And finally, taking forwards that concept of bringing together existing data, but also resident perspectives, is to pioneer new insights approaches and build data capability. As Alice outlined, we worked with the data that we had and also made recommendations about what data the council could collect in the future. And what's really interesting there about the approach that they're taking, but also about some of the things that we recommended, is that opportunity not just to think about quant and qualitative information separately, and not just to measure what's easy, but to really get to the heart of the matter about what do we need to collect and capture, and to understand are things working, and also what we need to take decisions. So this gives you a bit of an overview of the work that we did last summer for Waltham Forest. There'll be a chance to come back at the end for any questions about the detail of it. I'll hand back over to you, Gemma.
Great, thank you, Sian. We will take a 5-minute break, I think. So we will aim to start up again at about 2:27, 2:28. So please leave Zoom running. Please also remember that you can ask questions, so leave those in the question box at the bottom, and we will come to those at the end of the session. But yeah, please feel free to step away from the screen for 5 minutes, but leave Zoom running, and we'll start again at 14:28. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to stretch your legs and just look away from the screen for a few minutes. Please do keep the questions coming into the Q&A. And also just to make a note that this is being recorded and will be hosted on our website after the event. So if anyone wants to go and look back at some of the detail and things that have been talked about so far, you will be able to do that on our website. So this next section is going to be with John Lloyd, who's the Corporate Director of Strategy and Change, and also Ian Ray, who's Corporate Director of Regeneration, Planning and Delivery at Waltham Forest. And so I'm going to hand over around what's next to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm going to carry on really from the evidence and research and from the deep engagement that the Young Foundation did to talk about how we started to put this into practice. So I'm going to start with talking about the framework and how we reached that framework and why we think it's important and why we think it responds to some of the challenges around uncertainty and complexity, and then the need for representing people's experiences based on their demographics, but also based on where they live, and how we are starting now to pilot approaches, learning as we go, as well as how we are putting it into more place-based conversations in which Ian is going to bring to life for you. So firstly, before I move to the next slide, which is the framework, we're going to talk to you about why we are proud of the framework and why we think it responds to some of the challenges that residents have highlighted and indeed that we anticipated before we started. First, obviously, it's created by residents. So those residents were engaged in a kind of very open and broad way. So 1,500 people responded to a very open conversation that, you know, was effectively, the video kind of was a springboard for those conversations. But perhaps most importantly, the deeper work that the Young Foundation did spoke to a representative kind of sample of residents, effectively people from different areas, people from all walks of life, different ethnicities and different age groups, etc. Because sorry, so we've got a fire alarm going off, but hopefully it's
Are you do you need to leave?
I think we're being evacuated. Okay, we're really sorry. Is it?
No, it's all right. Safety first. So obviously, if you guys need to leave the call, then feel free. Sian, I don't know if there's anything you could do to jump in.
I wonder what we could do is, why don't we skip to me at the end, which will slightly give away the kind of conclusions, but why don't I go first, and then that maybe gives John and me a chance to evacuate and come back. I can hold the fort for 10 minutes.
Fine, great. I appreciate that, Sian. Thank you. And yeah, hopefully John and Ian will be able to get back to us. Thanks.
These things happen, real life, there you go. So I don't want to steal Waltham Forest thunder here in terms of telling you about what they're doing next. But where we wanted to kind of end this presentation is in giving you a bit of thoughts and some reflections from us about, as a organisation that's been working with a local council to think about this concept, but also as a council trying to do this in delivery, actually some of the kind of learnings and reflections that we've had as part of that process. And I'm sure many of you that are in this event will be at slightly different stages of thinking about 15-minute neighbourhoods. It might be that you came to this event out of curiosity. It might be actually you're quite far on in your journey. And we hope that,
like 400 people.
We hope that this will spur lots of different ideas and thoughts and questions that you might have. But to kind of give maybe kind of 3 kind of reflections or kind of categories of things, just that we would kind of be thinking about in terms of for other areas, and that kind of be at the heart of our approach. I just want to offer up some thoughts and reflections. I will say this section is going to be without slides, so kind of, yeah, just a chance to kind of hear some thoughts and reflections. So first of all, our 3 key things I'd like to kind of bring forward are, first of all, how we think about 15 minutes and the fluidity of thinking about that kind of concept. The second thing is the really important role for communities in being part of that journey, but also taking it forwards. And then finally, the kind of the value and opportunity of taking this approach at a strategic level. So first of all, to think about kind of the idea about what some of these learnings or reflections that we have about the nature of 15 minutes. As a couple of people have highlighted already on this call, it's such a simple concept, but one that probably benefits from being held loosely and not too rigidly. So what we're not saying here is absolutely think categorically in just 15 minutes. And I think one of the things that Councillor Williams said earlier is that we can often get quite tied up in the definition of it. And also we can debate the idea of, is it 10 minutes, is it 15 minutes, is it 20 minutes? I guess in treating it loosely, there's a real value in just focusing in on actually what do people really need to help thrive in their local areas. One of the key other kind of final kind of things to kind of take from this idea of 15 minutes is the value in thinking beyond assets. So yes, while the piece of work that we've kind of generated initially from residents does think about that collective list of assets, services and spaces, what's been really kind of powerful, hopefully we think, in the way that we thought about 15 minutes is to bring in those ideas about experiences and what a local area can enable in people's lives. And to root that idea about how we think about 15 minutes by really thinking about different residents and their individual needs and what they want, and to centre that, to think about that in that approach. And part of the way in which we've been able to think about that with Waltham Forest is where can you bring in other types of data and insights that tells you about who's living in a particular area and where your approach might need to adapt depending on your local kind of context. The final thing about how we think about this idea of 15 minutes and what might be useful to other areas is, while we're talking about specific neighbourhood level areas here, one of the things that we really wanted to reflect in this approach and this framework is there's still a connection more broadly. to other neighbouring 15 minutes, to thinking about actually what do residents need at that borough level, but also in the London context and also in other cities and other areas across the UK, thinking about actually how do residents still engage also more broadly across the city as well, and not to lose that connection. So a 15-minute neighbourhood concept, but one that is fluid and flexible and looks at surrounding context. And there may be things to learn there for other councils thinking about this approach. The second kind of area of learning and reflection is about thinking about the really critical role here for involving residents, both in the creation of any kind of vision and framework, but also on an ongoing basis. And hopefully what you've heard here from us is that residents have really played a critical role in shaping the approach that Waltham Forest are taking forwards. So first of all, that idea about moving beyond assets and actually thinking about those experiences is something that's come directly from residents and their visions for actually what they want from their local area. One of the things that we also think is a really important key lesson and reflection is this work has started with a participatory approach, so building on existing interactions that Waltham Forest have had with residents, but also really deeply engaging through this process of creating a vision and framework. We'd really recommend and think about actually how can that be taken forwards. And there's an opportunity here for local areas thinking about this concept to think about how can this be a way of creating a dialogue with residents, one that's open and honest and transparent, that creates that dialogue with residents and those adult conversations that are needed about actually what's needed within different local areas, but also one that can draw on existing civic strengths in different areas and involve residents in that change and enable resident-led action. To help support making their local areas what they want from them and to enable their lives. My final kind of area is this opportunity that Waltham Forest are taking forward about thinking about implementing this and thinking about this at that strategic level. So as you heard from Councillor Williams at the beginning, this is something that Waltham Forest are taking forwards into their corporate framework and will cut across a whole range of action that they are thinking about in relation to Waltham Forest. What we've noticed and observed as being part of this process is the topic of 15-minute neighbourhoods, because it centres on that idea about what we need from our localities, how do we think about connected places. It's quite unique. It's one of those unique topics that enables conversations about that join up different local areas, different departments, different topics to think about what do residents need for their lives that will enable them to thrive, to live healthily and sustainably within their localities. And so there's a real interesting opportunity here by what absolutely 15 minutes has come from the idea of planning and concepts around it, to move that concept and to talk to others working in other departments about it as a way of thinking about joined up areas of work and also within thinking about how we think about problem solving as well. And one of the things that's come out from the Waltham Forest work is, for example, the opportunity to have a forum that discusses this, that brings together different departments to talk about what this could mean and how they could learn from each other and work together as well. And we can also see that work there operationally as well, and how we're thinking about data and insight. So I'm wondering if I've given John and Ian enough time to get back in the building. I'm not entirely sure, but I
believe so. I believe brilliant. That John is back.
So I'll just close by saying these are, I guess, some of the kind of conclusions, summaries of kind of what we've learned. It'll be really interesting to kind of get into conversation with you about some of the things that you want to ask about. We are shortly going to publish the full report from this, and there are a range of principles and recommendations and actions that probably speak to a wider set of people as well as Waltham Forest that you can dig into to find out more. And with that, I'll hand back over to Gemma to hopefully bring back in John and Ian.
Yep, there's John. Brilliant. So thank you for that, Sean. And John, hopefully you can go back to where you were.
I can, yeah. Sorry about that, everybody. That's quite unusual. I've managed to find another building. The evacuation's still taking place. The host has stopped my video, so I'll talk perhaps until that's resolved. I'll pick up where I started from. In fact, it's not such a bad order, really. That unintentional pivot, because effectively we can see how we're responding to those recommendations. So going back to where the evidence got to in terms of shaping our framework, and why we think our framework is important and really fits Waltham Forest, but perhaps there's broader lessons for people putting into place 50-minute neighbourhood or even other place-based approaches. I talked about its creation by residents and how important that is, particularly in terms of reflecting different experiences and different demographics and even different kind of geographies of the borough. But also, obviously, what came across heavily in the evidence is 50-minute neighbourhoods shouldn't just be about the things, and feeling safe is probably a classic example of that. If you don't feel safe, you're not necessarily going to experience or view the facilities or assets or things within your community or neighbourhood in the same way as somebody else. And we also, based on some of those feelings around uncertainty and just for local government, for many colleagues, and it's been so uncertain that we really wanted it to be built on data and insight, and that was obviously built into the engagement process, but also in terms of the framework, so we could really start to understand some of the strengths and weaknesses of what residents were saying makes a great 50-minute neighbourhood across the borough, and respond differently to that, and not have a one-fits-all approach. And that speaks to a need for it to be more dynamic and flexible. So we wanted to be not a framework that sits on a wall, but a framework that data and our learning can shape over time. And I'll bring that to life a little bit in a moment. And of course, responding to the challenges that residents face, not necessarily the ones that we think they face as well. We know what the big ones are, but how are they experiencing them? So moving on to to speak more explicitly about this framework, this reflects that. So we have 3 rings that we call it, for want of a better name. And those reflect the kind of multi-dimensional elements of 50-minute neighbourhoods, moving on from perhaps a more kind of traditional place-based concepts of it. So start with the middle ring, which is the things in my neighbourhood should have, and access to services I need most, which is incredibly important to residents. They should be services should be affordable for me to use, and people spoke about green space being available in that area as well, and I can get around easily. So people talking about accessibility of pavements, but also cycling infrastructure and public transport and activities and support for different points of my life. So really keen that the engagement reflected that. People are going to experience or want different things at different points in their life. There'll be commonalities, but there'll be difference. So yeah, that's great. And I'll speak to the data and I'll speak to that in a moment, but the things are a really important part of it. But they can't be realized without understanding experience. So to the left, that outer ring, how I experience my neighborhood, is as important as the what and the facilities and the infrastructure. And that includes having a voice, that includes a place where I feel safe, that includes a place that I believe and I understand will suit my needs at different points in my life. And it's also a place that people belong to. And we have a really good start in Waltham Forest, because our insight says that people really do connect to the borough and they connect to their neighbourhoods, but that doesn't mean that that's not tested in different parts of the borough, and then people might experience it in different ways, and we need to understand that and respond to that. And then finally, that inner ring is about how we lead, but also how we help people improve their neighbourhood. So everyone working together to improve our borough. We need to make sure people can play an active part, that we make it easy. Sometimes we get out of the way when people want to improve their neighbourhoods and play an active part, but we also need to take responsibility and also make our partners accountable for many of the things that really improve 15-minute neighbourhoods. That means working together with our health and police partners, for example, acting in unison, as well as holding each other to account. So that I'll speak more detail in a moment on that, but the things and those and how residents experience in them, whilst how the council leads, form the basis of our framework for realising the 50-minute neighbourhoods that residents want us to realise. So moving on to the next slide, how is that underpinned by data? So I won't go through all of these, and indeed you'll have the slides, but to pick one as an example, again, priorities on the wall are not a great way to face the challenges that we're facing. We need to be able to understand how their experience and the impact of those over time, and to also see if we're making success in certain parts of the borough. So feeling safe, for example, we have a representative sample that we ask twice a year of over 750 people how they are experiencing and feeling, and their views on a whole range of things, but feeling safe being one of them. So we've got really ongoing live data on how people are how people are feeling about fear of crime and violence. But also there's the very realistic data, the very kind of, like, you know, the live data, the very practical impact data of number of antisocial behaviour incidences and number of offences in the borough. So that's an example of metrics that bring to life that concept of feeling safe, both through experience but both in kind of practical impact. And each one of those priorities identified by residents is supported by data. So let's have a look at that on the next slide of how that works in practice. So we want a 50-minute neighbourhood framework to impact our decision making, and we want to be able to respond to different parts of the borough in different ways if that's appropriate. So looking at an overall view of 50-minute neighbourhoods in terms of strengths and challenges, you can see that there's clear difference across the borough. Some of that will be more based on access to amenities. Some of that will be might be more specific to getting around, for example, but overall there's definitely some differences, and those differences are fairly interesting and unique and need to be understood in a more granular way. So looking at how I access services that I need most. You can see there are gaps within the north of the borough that we really want to kind of understand and work with residents in different ways to help them access that. I mean, it's not as densely populated, there are different types of challenges. What about a closer look at feeling safe? So you might, some of those areas, particularly in the middle of the borough, have really strong strengths in terms of the other aspects of 50-minute neighbourhoods, access to amenities. Some of that is access to green space as well. But you see there are some real challenges around feeling safe. And even though, you know, overall it might pose a kind of fairly strength-based picture, that there are things that need to be addressed and new ways of working to test in those areas as well. So the granularity really helps us in terms of our decision making and our ways of working, and also conversations with partners and police going forward. Now, moving on to trying to bring to life on the next slide how we view 50-minute neighbourhoods and how we're piloting and approaching that work. So we talked about the how being as important as the what, and we talked about our role in leadership. So I'm going to try and bring that to life. And I know there's a bit of text on this slide, so we're going to use the pictures to kind of illustrate that. So the way we view it is at the kind of quite foundational point of that is obviously the things that a 50-minute neighbourhood needs, and there's loads of guidance and evidence on that, but indeed we've also got the research and views from our residents that have helped shape that. And of course you have, we can view any place within the borough and understand where there are challenges around access to healthcare and childcare, for example, and we can also see where there might be access to green space, and as well as some of the other areas that are part of their framework there. But that of course is not enough. So moving to the next slide, how we view the how as important as the what is, right, okay, but how do we work with those assets? How do we strengthen those in terms of how we work? So here are some examples of how we're how we're piloting and testing and expanding our place-based approach, which is really thinking about the experiences and the ways that we work with residents, as opposed to just simply the things that they need and want and have access to. So examples of that are, right, we know that feeling safe, for example, is an issue. We saw some of that on the graph. So we want to try new approaches with police. We want to do pop-up police stations and bring back a more visibility and more access to enforcement and police where it needs to be. But most importantly, the way we work is an important part of that. So we want to kind of, instead of having more kind of siloed traditional services of we'll enforce this part of it and we'll talk to you about antisocial behaviour over here, a much more kind of joined up, visible and kind of multidisciplinary presence to start solving problems with residents in the communities. So quite simply, we want to use our assets where we can base ourselves and be more available to the public. We want to change the way that we lead to some degree in terms of, right, work with our police in a different way and say we need to solve these problems in unison and together, whilst we also want to change the way that we work with residents in terms of problem solving, acting quickly, etc. So just as kind of an example in that how we work, really improving experience where assets and buildings aren't simply enough. Now moving on to the next slide, and that really speaks about that leadership. So we know we don't have a huge amount of anchor institutions in the borough, but we have some really important statutory partners, and that those include the police, and we have Whips Cross, and we all have our kind of health partners in delivering primary care. We know that we need to work differently, and we're starting to use 15-minute neighbourhoods for conversations with them. For example, some of you might be aware the Fuller report in terms of how primary care is due to be delivered actually kind of speaks to some of the principles that we've talked about today in terms of neighbourhood teams, in terms of continuity of care. And our conversations with our primary care partners, for example, starting to use the evidence in here around 15-minute neighbourhoods, where we can really begin to think about, well, how can we act in unison? How can we use this evidence and insight to improve our decision making, and start to think about how we deliver our services more jointly, for example. So the way we lead is really important in terms of our partners, but also the way we participate with our residents is there's definitely, and indeed Councillor Williams spoke about that, a sea change in that. When we have a problem, we try and solve it together. We're open and transparent about that, and that is a real new deal in terms of participation and joint working, both with our residents, but also with the VCS as well. And using data is going to be a really part of that. We know that we face kind of financial challenges. It's very difficult indeed for many organisations and councils to prioritise. So using data to think, where do we need to act the most? And indeed, the framework helps us to realise that, and helps us perhaps. A universal approach isn't always necessary, but local targeted approaches will yield better value for money, for example. And we're starting to, and our strategy sets out, there are areas where we want to transform the council. Now, silos are kind of logical in some ways, but in other ways, we need to make sure that actually that's not what residents experience when we're dealing with like local challenges. We need a joined up response, and sometimes that's a single point of contact. Sometimes again, that's more multidisciplinary working. So we're looking at how we transform the council going forward as well. So just to highlight, to kind of summarize on a few examples on the next slide of how that is happening right now. So our strategy spells out a whole range of the place-based interventions that we need to make that will have a huge impact on quality of life within the borough, and indeed reflected through the framework, from theatres to new health facilities to youth hubs and health hubs. But how we work is a really important part of that. But it's impacting things that we didn't anticipate that when we started this work. For example, our cost of living response. Some of the principles and a lot of the evidence that we have from the process really shape that work in really important ways. For example, we may have in the past, when faced with the winter crisis and people not being able to afford their bills and looking for respite and even warmth in terms of facing the cost of living crisis, we might have kind of had a more traditional response of using our council assets and perhaps not necessarily use the insight in a kind of more sophisticated way, perhaps it not being as participatory. But we've really used the evidence and started to use the principles in the framework to develop that. So for example, we had 47 community living rooms around the borough and started to join up service provision and support and advice in those kind of welcoming places in a very different way than we might have done before. Pop-up police stations being the tip of an iceberg of a different way of working around community safety, where we acknowledge that fear of the crime is really, really important, and not just indeed, and bringing our partners with us on that as well as the kind of harder edge stuff around crime numbers. We're testing new youth hubs within parts of the borough, again in places where we might not have gone before, in community buildings. Sometimes we're even innovating in fast food restaurants. That's where young people that are often excluded from school are going, so we'll go to them. And finally, and Ian will speak to this much more elegantly than I will, our conversations around kind of development and the opportunities within areas indeed that are perhaps experiencing more development, really bring into life the principles and ways of working around 15-minute neighbourhoods. on that. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Ian to speak to that.
Great, thanks John. Afternoon everyone. I'm Ian Ray, Corporate Director for Regeneration Planning and Delivery here at Waltham Forest. So as John said, we've really tried to enshrine 50-minute neighbourhood principles into our strategic planning at the council, and our new local plan really does that in what we consider quite a big way. So our growth strategy for the borough essentially splits Waltham Forest into 3: north, central and south. And within each of those sub areas, we identify 50-minute neighbourhoods that are going to be subject to the most transformational change and investment in the borough, but also those areas that have the biggest opportunities for both character-led regeneration, but also investment in new infrastructure, as well as some of those people policies that John mentioned. So that's quite transformational for Waltham Forest. It means that we've got quite a tailored, localised approach to each of our areas. The areas are primarily based on high streets and town centres, but also our industrial areas and areas for businesses. So alongside the delivery of 27,000 new homes over the next 15 years, we've also identified opportunities for over 50,000 metres square of new employment space, but also a whole range of investment in green spaces. So we've got 40 new and improved open spaces and green spaces being delivered alongside that growth. And we've also got opportunities for new healthcare facilities, new education facilities, and also new retail as part of our wider town centre strategy. So it's a huge opportunity for us, and we're trying to look at which parts of the borough can have a nuanced response and actually be led by the communities that live in different parts of the borough, and also the businesses that are located there. So in that way, we want to celebrate the unique character of the borough, and also have some genuine projects that are co-created with the local community, and help them identify funding to actually deliver them, which I'll come on to with a couple of examples in a moment. So on the next slide, I sort of showed the first of those examples. So Leytonstone is one of our district centres. It's our second largest town centre. It's relatively well connected in Greater London, but it is sort of characterised by big box retail developments from the 1980s, which have actually created physical severance and problems in terms of the cohesiveness of the town centre and also the vibrancy of the town centre. So a big part of our approach through both the local plan and the Leytonstone area framework is to come up with proposals with the local community to improve some of those challenges and actually respond to how we can bring forward the town centre as a more cohesive place, but also one that is better for local businesses and is actually much easier for local residents to access some of the services that John's referred to in the right way. So we've got a series of large development opportunity sites within Leytonstone, but a big part of the framework is to actually look at the spaces in between those development sites, trying to get more retail frontage onto the high road, reduce car dominance, improve air quality, improve access to open spaces, including Epping Forest, and look at how we can engage with local residents and businesses as part of that. So we've established a town team in Leytonstone, which is led by local businesses, but is really leading some of the tangible projects that will come through the area frameworks. And we've done quite a lot of engagement over the last 18 months, bringing forward some of those detailed projects. And rather than just being an area-based plan, we want the area framework to be a list of live projects that we actually work on delivery with the local community. And to assist with that further, Leytonstone is part of central government's High Street Task Force. So we're looking at a series of interventions during 2023 as part of that government-wide programme. And then the second example I wanted to flag up on the next slide is something a little bit different again. So looking at Walthamstow Town Centre, which is our largest town centre and our major centre, we've tried to build on that legacy that Councillor Williams referred to earlier as London's first borough of culture. And that's really been the centre of our successful bid to the government's round 2 of the Levelling Up Fund, where we've secured over £17 million of funding to actually bring forward council assets in the town centre, but bringing forward those assets as cultural hubs and as opportunities for workspace and enterprise space for local businesses and local people, but in a way that actually lines up with a lot of our wider initiatives around jobs creation and local skills and training as well. So there's sort of key heritage assets that will be brought forward as part of that levelling up funding as part of our wider 15-minute neighbourhoods approach to Walthamstow Town Centre. We're also looking at how we can, through direct investment from the council, continue to build up that cultural offer in the town centre. And so the flagship scheme for that is Soho Theatre Walthamstow, which will be opening up in 2024 following the acquisition of the council of a redundant former Art Deco cinema building, which is statutory listed and is being completely refurbished to be opened as Soho Theatre's main comedy theatre venue in London, and actually completely transforming what the Walthamstow Town Centre offer will be both during the daytime and the evening. And that's further complemented by a lot of the council delivered schemes that have already been referred to today, not least Fellowship Square, where again it's about trying to show how council assets can become part of a new neighbourhood and actually complement the existing residential catchment in the area, so that we have new cultural facilities in and around the town centre, which actually adds people's 15-minute neighbourhoods and also their perception of what is their space in and around the town centre and what they can actually use throughout the day, going into the evening and cultural events as well. We've also got several key links here to our creative enterprise zone at Black Horse Lane, where we've got a huge number of creative businesses, as well as key training providers, which is all contributing towards our wider local economy and actually linking in with some of those cultural assets as well. And there's further investment there, private investment in terms of bringing forward cultural venues, including a new standard music venue, which again replaces a redundant and vacant former cultural asset in the Black Horse Road part of the town centre. And then one of the key transformational elements we've got coming to Walthamstow Town Centre is the University of Portsmouth, who will be launching their London campus in Walthamstow again in 2024. So that's a huge sort of step change for us and how we view 15-minute neighbourhoods, and actually not just contributing towards the physical regeneration of Walthamstow Town Centre, but also thinking about the jobs and skills opportunities that will create, the opportunities for learning, but also some of the supply chain opportunities with our local businesses, as well as research and development. So the local plan sets the strategic context for that focus of growth, but thinking about what would be most suitable for our major town centre and how that can have both borough-wide impacts, and then zooming in to some of those localised benefits as well, not least through some of the cultural-led regeneration that we're taking forward. So I'll pause there, having just to set out some of those key examples.
Great. Thank you very much, John and Ian. Thank you for maybe running outside and running back inside again. We really appreciate you doing that. So Sian's already sort of been through some of this key learning reflection. So we've got some time now to look at some questions that have been coming in, and there's still time to add to those. So we could just go to the next slide, Abby. So what we're going to do is invite John and Ian to be on the screen, as well as Sian, and also introduce Richard Harries, who's Associate Director with the Young Foundation and has lots of wisdom to impart on this subject as well. So you can stop the slide share so that we can be on the screen. That's wonderful. Great. I think I might just start with an initial question to Sian, if that's okay. And one of the sort of key things that came through was just this query about who you engaged with, how you found them, and how that sort of process went, and how you sort of dealt with the representation issues around that as well. So start there.
Sure. So to start with, I guess I've got kind of, three things I'll kind of mention there. So I guess, first of all, in approaching this topic, we knew it was really important to think about how do we get deep representative engagement across the borough, but also thinking about where we might want to target some of our work. So thinking about individuals that maybe otherwise aren't heard, but also thinking about how do we work in particular areas across the borough. So our kind of first step was to really work closely with Waltham Forest just to understand at the moment, what data do they have, what insights have they gathered, and also who do they typically hear from when they go out to talk to residents. So where might be some of the existing gaps and what they know about kind of what residents want and how they want to engage. And from there, what we developed was looking at demographic data about who is in different areas across the borough and what's that typical kind of sample. An approach for thinking about at different stages within our research, how are we going to engage with residents, who we needed to speak to, what were some of those kind of target numbers that we wanted to achieve, etc. What we did when kind of starting out kind of then in our qualitative research phases, which took place last summer, is first of all did a kind of call to action to residents to be involved. So to be part of a sampling group that could be involved at different stages of the work. And we did that using the council's channels. We did that through our own channels. We also reached out to a range of community partners working within the locality to reach deeply out and make sure that we had a kind of a group that we could reach out to throughout the work to be engaged. And I think about 1,000 people responded to that. But we did top up that number as we went through the process. So, for example, going out to different areas where local residents were, as well as thinking about actually who's volunteered to be part of this work. Then at each stage of looking at the different pieces of research that we did, we developed an individual sampling framework for who we wanted to make sure that we spoke to. We carefully monitored through the process, making sure that actually we were looking at both specific demographics, thinking about different areas and different localities that we wanted to make sure that we had perspectives from, and I guess also thinking about intersectionality as well. So one of the things that we really wanted to be keen about is thinking about particular groups or moments in life where actually you might be thinking a bit differently about your kind of 15 minutes and making sure that we included those individuals' voices. We also developed our kind of methods and mechanisms to be online and offline as well, recognising that digital exclusion can prevent people from being involved. So a range of different methods and mechanisms across the different ways that we wanted to kind of build up this insight, as well as drawing on existing Waltham Forest work. What I would say, because it tends to come up, is we did provide vouchers for people's time. So that was something that we wanted to really value the time that people were involving to be part of this work. And that might be slightly different. So for some people that might have been a couple of hours, for some people it might have been deeper engagement. So that was something that was really important to us to make sure that if people are going to be engaged, if we're going to be part of their work, we are paying them for their time to be able to do that, but also making sure we play back what we found. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sian. And then I was going to come to a question that's arisen. I know that all of you have talked about this sort of fluidity of the concept, but there was a question around, what's the best way to determine the centre of a 15-minute neighbourhood and where the boundary ends, and if that's all subjective, how does it all work? And I think, Richard, you were going to offer some thoughts on that one.
Yes, thanks, Gemma. And I mean, I was just say I was obviously closely involved with Sian and Alice on the project, and took a particularly close interest in the data analysis. And in many ways, the natural assumption is, well, you start with, I think Councillor William mentioned it, the wards, and we've got data on the wards, so that's the obvious area that you might want to start. But of course, you could choose any boundaries you wanted. But I think there are two important things to bear in mind here. First of all, two residents in the same estate will have a different 15-minute boundary around them. An elderly resident with mobility issues might find that some of the pavements in the area make parts of the area inaccessible, so that limits their 15-minute geography. A younger person might be worried about youth gangs in the area, and that limits their 15-minute neighbourhood. So it's a sort of slightly fruitless exercise to think of it in terms of lines on maps, and that's really the second point. And I think Councillor Williams mentioned this. It's not primarily about lines on maps or centres and boundaries. It's about a new relationship between the council and the residents, and creating a framework that allows for a kind of a fresh dialogue about what matters to local people and what their priorities are and what they want to see within their own personal 15-minute neighbourhoods, not somebody top down sort of saying, here it is, here's this sort of exact boundaries that will now define Waltham Forest's 15-minute areas. So I hope that makes sense in terms of the way that we try to approach this.
Yeah, that's great. And that sort of links to, there's a question around the sort of the maturity of that approach, and you know, how do we help other places to sort of begin to reach that level of maturity in terms of co-design, and rather than sort of consultation as some of us maybe more cynically know it. I don't know from Waltham Forest point of view, John and Ian, if you've got any thoughts about how that really developed, that sort of maturity of approach, rather than maybe ways that we've done things before.
I can kick off and maybe Ian will come in. I think I think residents and councillors and businesses understand it when you say, if we decide what we think your 50-minute neighbourhood is, you'll tell us to go away, and they'll understand that, because it will be different for different people. But at the same time, that it is a challenge, because conceptually you could argue there are 280,000 50-minute neighbourhoods. That's how many residents we have. But the way that we've reached that, or at least we're reaching that maturity, is to talk about 50-minute neighbourhoods as understanding an area better. So having that insight, and that we can have conversations about different areas and different size, but we'll still understand how people's 50-minute neighbourhoods can improve within those areas. That can be at ward level. That can be that could be when we're talking to health colleagues about their catchment areas. As long as we're bringing that insight and understanding that actually there are multiple 50-minute neighbourhoods within there, and there's multiple different types of experience, we would just need to have an early conversation about that and be really clear that if you decide on what people's 50-minute neighbourhoods are, there are actual practical problems in terms of, well, people might live on the edge of that boundary and that doesn't make any sense, but also it's not necessarily how all those people within that area will view that neighbourhood, and then you have legitimacy problems. So I think you have to have just an early conversation about it and talk about 50-minute neighbourhoods as a way of understanding, as a way of insight, and as a way, like Richard said, of having conversations with residents to agree actions and solving problems.
And I think sort of it is that sort of conversational approach that, although it can take a lot of time and resource, it probably ultimately saves time. So with our area frameworks to actually come up with regeneration proposals, it's taken 18 months in the areas that we've already undertaken those in. So we've had an initial sort of engagement session to try and articulate residents' key priorities and objectives, and then initial ideas for projects, and then done a lot of work in the interim to actually understand what those tangible projects could be, and then sort of played back to residents and ward councillors what the opportunities are, and then tried to go back with funding opportunities to actually deliver them. And so it's been that sort of constant ongoing dialogue that's helped, rather than just having old-fashioned consultation where we've had that one hit and not really got anywhere. So although it's probably been more resource intensive in the medium term, we've probably got to the projects quicker and with more sign up than we might have done if we'd just gone for a more traditional approach.
Ian, as well, how does this approach sort of link to any neighbourhood planning work that's going on in the borough?
Quite well. So we've got one neighbourhood plan in Hymes Park, where we've got an adopted neighbourhood plan and a very active Hymes Park planning group. So we have a good relationship with the group, and it's been sort of that sort of co-creation of projects and co-design of projects that's been important. So although our Levelling Up Fund submission in the north of the borough wasn't ultimately successful, it was sort of co-led by the Hymes Park planning user group, and again we're working on a lot of public realm improvements to bring forward new community space, including a space in Hymes Park Station that we've just opened up over the last few weeks. That was all done in partnership with the Hymes Park planning group. So it kind of gives us a bit of a head start in Hymes Park, because we've got that sort of active engagement already from a planning user group. Whereas in other parts of the borough, we've had to sort of, I suppose, use other types of mechanisms and other types of community groups. It's not to say we only talk to the planning user group, because there's quite a diverse community in Hymes Park and lots of different groups to engage with, but it certainly, I think, helps with deliverability, because we've got a very mobilised group who are also quite good at accessing funding of their own through the likes of the GLA. So that has given an advantage in that area.
So lots of people have already mentioned sort of different funding streams. So there is a question here about, you know, what does this sort of approach cost in terms of budget, and where you see maybe the added value, or how the costs maybe are higher in the beginning and pay out over the longer term? Anyone got any sort of thoughts on that budgeting side of things, what it's cost and where you see those benefits to that expense are?
I suppose from a planning and regeneration point of view, if I kick off, it's more about prioritisation. So, for example, we're using this engagement as the basis for deciding ultimately how we will prioritise neighbourhood SIL expenditure, and a lot of the area framework projects are securing sexual ethics and strategic SIL funding, as well as levelling up funding. So there's an opportunity to also look at sort of emerging external funding like UK Shared Prosperity Fund. So I think it is more about prioritisation and trying to get collective buy-in for ultimately how the council can work with the community to allocate funding. It's not necessarily going to create any new funding, but I think it does open up doors and at least gives that sort of agreed prioritisation that perhaps would be more knotted and less well defined if we hadn't have undertaken the 50-minute neighbourhoods work.
Anyone else want to say anything about Richard?
Just quickly, if I can, and it's obviously not my place to talk about council funding issues at all, but the one thing I did want to observe is something that, again, Councillor Williams said at the start about the approach the council's taken to 50-minute neighbourhoods. And just speaking as a partner working with Waltham Forest on this, one of the things that was so delightful when we started was quite clearly how right across the council, all the different teams were already focused on 50-minute neighbourhoods and saw what they were doing, whether it's highways or housing, regen. They saw it all in the framework of 50-minute neighbourhoods, and that actually makes things a lot more efficient and smoother, and actually I think gets best value for the council. So as I say, it's not a comment directly about the funding streams, but the approach the council has taken, I'm sure, has paid dividends in that regard.
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing about that cross-council working, isn't it? You've got access to sort of maybe different ways of bringing funding together in order to sort of do some of this stuff. One of the big questions in the room is about the sort of recent things in the media about 50-minute neighbourhoods, about the experience of Oxfordshire, and so a question around, how have the council found talking about 50-minute neighbourhoods, if there's been any sort of pushback on the concept, and also how that links often to low traffic neighbourhoods and traffic control, and how are you having those difficult conversations, if they are difficult, in Waltham Forest?
Shall we go this one? I mean, the first thing to say is Enjoy Waltham Forest and Mini Holland was quite a long time ago. So, I mean, the conversations were difficult. There are images of protests outside the town hall that are before my time. And I'm not saying that conversations around people-friendly streets and active travel are still easier, but the fact is Waltham Forest has been through quite a long journey of these sort of measures, and also has a strong evidence base. But most importantly, it can show examples of where people are enjoying the benefits, and that. So there has been a significant change within Waltham Forest that perhaps some other boroughs, by accident or design, are experiencing for the first time, as opposed to 8 years ago, for example. But I think when we work with partners, we still have quite challenging conversations around the trade-offs of some of those priorities within 15-minute neighbourhoods. And as long as we're honest with the evidence and spend, as Ian said before, spend time kind of explaining why we're doing things, and what's the rationale for this, and to some degree the choices that we're making as in terms of evidence and trade-offs, then that does dissipate some of the tension and protest over time. But I think mainly is actually we've been this is a long time now. We've been building on 50-minute neighbourhood concepts, including active travel measures. So we really are perhaps past the kind of harder bit of that, but we're kind of always open to debate, let's say.
Richard, do you want to come in on there?
Well, just really add and repeat what John said, and sound a bit like a cracked record. The key thing about 15-minute neighbourhoods is it's not about the perfect solution that resolves all the problems and tensions that exist in any geographical area. We'll never do that. It's about having a better way to surface those tensions and to discuss them within a framework that works for residents and for the council. You know, that's where the opportunity comes, not, as I say, lines on maps or perfect planning solutions.
Yeah. Sian, did you want to say a word about how that played out in the research?
Sure. So I think just to kind of echo John's kind of point, it is kind of a conversation that has a history within kind of Waltham Forest. And so one of the things that we were really thinking about as we wanted to kind of design and approach this research is 15 minutes is a concept that is beyond active travel and traffic. And so while we've seen that kind of emerge in the kind of research and people talking about that as well, it is also about wider themes as well. And some of the things that came out from the kind of partnership working groups and thinking about some of those trade-offs and choices that John talked about, but the value of working with residents and having that open and honest conversation. People are adults, they understand that some of those choices have to be made, but they want to be engaged as part of that process where they can. So yes, I guess that's kind of what we kind of found as we were going through that process and that experience, and why we generated the type of framework that we did to allow for that conversation about some of these topics.
One of the other themes is around sort of the data, but also that quality of experience. And you know, how do you collect data on the quality of things and the quality of experience, and then how do you feed that into then future service delivery or design of things within the borough? Sian, will you?
I'm happy to come in to start, but it might be useful to kind of also pick up with either John or Ian how that's taken forward. So it's a really important point. And I guess one of the reasons why in designing the types of indices and frameworks that we didn't want to just say, great, you've got, I'll take an example, a GP in your local area. Actually, that could be the case for most people. We wanted to kind of move beyond thinking about just those kinds of asset, service, and experience, to think about that type of experience. So what's key there is, I guess, setting the bar a little bit higher, how we measure ourselves. And I guess one of the things that was really welcome by Waltham Forest is recognising that actually initially there might be kind of areas around kind of experience or areas across the borough where actually there's work to be done, and I guess recognising that challenge but also being open to it. So the recommendations that we kind of made and that Waltham Forest are working towards are looking where there might be other opportunities to bring together quantitative data, qualitative data in different ways to focus in on those types of experiences. And I might hand over to John or Ian without putting on the spot to talk a bit more about that.
I suppose from my point of view, it's kind of linking it into our infrastructure planning. So making it sort of fine-grained and actually looking at infrastructure planning in a sort of spatial way. So rather than a traditional approach of just having a sort of overarching set of infrastructure headlines for the borough as a whole, we've tried to give that a real spatial dimension and a 15-minute neighbourhoods dimension, and actually understand what the need for infrastructure is in different locations and different 15-minute neighbourhoods around the borough, because it does vary quite considerably. And then as part of our new local plan, we've got quite a sort of, I suppose, a step change in the sophistication of our monitoring. So for example, those 40 new open and green spaces that I mentioned that we're delivering, we've got quite stringent monitoring targets around increasing visitor numbers around those to actually measure how successful they will be, and actually what impact they will make. We've got similar indicators around air quality and mitigating flood risk, all sort of key outcomes of the local plan, but things that we wouldn't probably do at that sort of granular level of detail and wouldn't necessarily measure at the 15-minute neighbourhood level. So I think it's trying to ingrain that in our wider approach to infrastructure planning, which is going to make a big difference on my side.
Yeah, just to add to that, we are blessed and that we choose to invest in fairly extensive resident engagement and insight. So, for example, we'll ask a question about how people trust the council, how people trust and connect with their neighbourhood, and that's 750 people across the borough twice a year, which we're looking to expand. We want to complement that with citizen panels and some elements of citizen science, using volunteers within the neighbourhood. So we do already have a rich set of data that's also representative, over-representative, so we can really listen to perhaps groups that are seldom heard. So just to add on, many of those are actually embedded within the 15-minute neighbourhood framework that you've seen. So that mix of kind of qualitative and quantitative is really important to us.
Richard, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, This is a researcher's plea, really, because as John says, we found it incredibly helpful having access to the resident insight survey data from Waltham Forest. But in a parallel project we did a couple of years ago for the Greater London Authority, looking at civic strength across the capital, one of the challenges we faced was that, each borough asked very similar questions, but not quite the same. And so you can't really compare them. And so, wherever possible, it's always great when people use existing survey questions, because then you get a natural baseline and you get continuity, which makes everyone's life a lot easier. Again, when we started this project, one of the surveys we looked at was the government's community life survey, which does ask a question about what people think is important within 20 minutes of where they live. And although that only goes down to a regional level, so we only had data for the whole of London, it nevertheless gave us a baseline to think, well, how far is Waltham Forest from that London-wide baseline? So I think, a plea for others on the call who are thinking of adopting this approach, always go for that standard approach. I see that the government with the Shared Prosperity Fund is setting up a new Pride in Place and Life Chances survey. And as part of that, they actually want to create a local authority tool precisely so that local authorities can replicate the national survey in local areas to get that more fine-grained data, but in a way that is robust and comparable. So a researcher's apology, but there we go.
Fair enough. So one of the other themes that sort of came out to me from the questions was actually, was there any, this seems like a bit of a strange question in a way, but was there any consideration of the fact that people pass through Waltham Forest? So there's a question about the ultra low emission zone, but there's also this sense that because of where you are, people might come through Waltham Forest to get further into London or further out. And so was there any sort of consideration of those people that are perhaps using your borough but not living in it, and how this might affect them?
I'll quickly go first on that, because it was one of the first things we looked at, actually, as I recall. We were thinking about not so much people passing through the borough, but actually people in the borough going elsewhere, and particularly, for example, residents going to the Olympic Park, for example, and therefore therefore for a lot of residents, their 50-minute neighbourhood might not be in the borough. But of course, the council had recent experience of that through the pandemic, where there'd been a lot of cross-borough working. I think that put them in a stronger position. But again, I don't want to overstep the mark. Ian and John might have more to say about that.
Well, I think the Olympic Park's a good example. So that's sort of something that we considered sort of on our doorstep. So we were very keen that we didn't look at Waltham Forest as an island. And it's probably, I suppose, most prominent in terms of our approach to public transport enhancements and strategic transport. So through our sort of wider 15-minute neighbourhoods work, we've tried to make it easier for both our residents and sort of wider populations who use the London public transport system to actually make it easier to get around, and we want our residents to be able to more easily access job opportunities in central London and beyond, but also make it easier for them to get to those opportunities. So we've had a real focus on station upgrades. So through our levelling up funding, again, we've managed to secure with TfL improvements to Leighton Station, and we're doing the same with Walthamstow Central Station and other improvements. So that will have benefits to people passing through Waltham Forest on public transport, and actually reducing congestion. And then in terms of vehicle transport, we've tried to have a bit of a focus on the North Circular, the A406, because that's probably the main route where people pass through Waltham Forest. And at the moment, it kind of does cause quite a lot of severance because it's such a physical barrier. It causes issues in terms of accessibility, but also we've got quite a big logistics sector and industrial sector that rely on that access to the road network, and also some opportunities for investment along the North Circular corridor, as we called it. So we have thought about sort of that wider connectivity and impacts, but it's always with a view to how it would benefit our residents as well as those people who are passing through.
Yeah. So from there, going all the way back out, every single time we run a webinar like this, there's always the question of what about rural places? So what about places that are not like Waltham Forest in any way, shape or form? So have you got any thoughts about how a concept like the 15-minute neighbourhood approach could be applied in sort of rural areas?
I'm certainly happy to have a go at that. Definitely now at the risk of sounding like a cracked record and trying to avoid my cat from walking onto the screen in front of me here. the key thing is that 50-minute neighbourhoods, as I say, is not about geography primarily. It's about relationships. And so, what you want is a way of having a conversation, a dialogue with your residents. So if you're a rural area rather than an urban area, the question isn't what can people access within 50 minutes, but what is important to people where they live, and how can you, as a local authority, assist them in that. And so it undoubtedly would be a different approach, but fundamentally the idea of talking to residents and doing that sort of deep ethnography and qualitative work that Sian and Alice were talking about earlier is the starting point. And it's trying to get under the skin of what local residents actually want, whether it's rural or urban. And that's the sort of work that at the Young Foundation we do all the time. And if there's anybody who would like to know a little bit more about that, do get in touch with Alice or Sian or me after this call. We'd be happy to discuss it with you.
That's brilliant segue, Richard, because we've sort of run out of time, unfortunately, and hopefully we managed to get to lots of the questions that people were asking. We're just going to pop up a last slide, which does have contact details on it for those of you who are interested in knowing more from Waltham Forest itself, or knowing more from the Young Foundation about the work that they've been doing. And equally, I just need to say thank you to everybody. The TCPA website also has a host of information about 20-minute neighbourhoods and about all of the things that we've been talking about, and our contact details can be found on our website. But thank you very, very much to everybody who's been here today, to all of our panelists and those that have presented. It's a really, really fascinating piece of work, and I'm really excited to see where it goes from here, because this is very much just the beginning for Waltham Forest. And yeah, hopefully we'll have you back at some point, maybe in a couple of years, to see what's happened on the ground. So thank you very, very much, everybody. I hope you have an enjoyable rest of the afternoon, and this recording will make its way onto our website in the next week or so, and you can watch it again or share it with colleagues, and that's it from us. Thanks, everybody. Take care.